probably the most important thing that I ever bring to a session is my own well-regulated presence.
Welcome to episode number 197 of the Couples Therapist Couch.
Welcome to the Couples Therapist Couch, the podcast for couples therapists, marriage counselors, and relationship coaches to explore the practice of couples therapy. And now, your host, Shane Birkel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Couples Therapist Couch. This is your host, Shane Birkel, and this is the podcast that's all about the practice of couples therapy. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoy the episode and you want to be part of a community, then definitely join the Couples Therapist Couch Facebook group. That's completely free. Obviously, you can always join the Couples Therapist Inner Circle, which is the paid basically an amazing supervision group where we talk about couples therapy. Therapists ask questions. There's a ton of course material on working with affairs, working with emotionally focused therapy, doing relational life therapy, all kinds of different course material that you can get access to. And I'm really excited. I'm sort of revamping the whole inner circle, and there's a new business option which is about building your couples therapy practice, which it could be an add-on to the clinical side of things if that's something that's a good fit for you. So go over to the website and check it out. You can get a lot more details and information. I don't want to take too much time talking about it here on the podcast, but it's something you should definitely take a look at if it feels like that could be a good fit for you. This week, I'm really excited to share with you an interview with Anita Mandley, who's an integrative psychotherapist with over 30 years of experience. And 2 years ago, I went to her training at the Networker Symposium, and I was so impressed and I learned so much, and I knew that I had to have her on the podcast. And I learned so much again when we talked this time. She talks all about repairing ancestral trauma. And we talk a lot about trauma. We talk about our childhoods and experiences that we've had. But she's talking about trauma that goes back generations from before we were born, and that the way in which our ancestors experienced that trauma plays through the generations and impacts us today. So without further introduction, I'm very excited to share with you the interview with Anita Mandley. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Couples Therapist Couch. This is Shane Birkel, and today I'm speaking with Anita Mandley. She's an integrative psychotherapist with 30 years of experience working with intergenerational developmental trauma, as well as an educator and workshop presenter. Hey Anita, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here with you, Shane.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. Just so the audience knows, I attended one of Anita's presentations at the Psychotherapy Networker Symposium almost 2 years ago now. And you were talking all about repairing ancestral trauma, which I just got so much out of that. Thank you so much for educating me about that. And so I really wanted to bring you on the show. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit and other aspects of therapy. But why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself to start with?
Okay. As Shane said, as you said, I am a integrative therapy. I work primarily with developmental trauma and intergenerational trauma, and not so much shock trauma, but trauma that has there's been a lot of repetitions of experiences of feeling powerless, disconnected, devalued, someone's out of control. So I think that trauma, my perspective is that trauma is a lot less about the event than it is about the impact of the events. Yeah. And so also around in the mid 90s, I think I had this awareness that everybody I worked with had these experiences, these particular experiences. And I worked even a lot with the chronically mentally ill and people who had access to diagnoses like narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. But I realized actually in working with such a wide variety of clients that everybody had those experiences of feeling powerless, disconnected, devalued, out of control. And I think especially we don't necessarily think of the chronically mentally ill as around trauma, but I can't think of anything more traumatic than to lose my mind,
Yeah,
right? That's
absolutely.
pretty traumatic.
Absolutely.
So that's when I began in earnest. And at that time, people didn't really talk too much about trauma, at least not in
Mhm.
my circles. And so I had to really go outside of my work environment and really seek out information. And so that kind of put me on the path. And
Mhm.
then I kind of realized that over time, I used to do a lot of DBT. I actually developed the first comprehensive, worked on and developed one of the first comprehensive DBT programs in the state of
Oh,
Illinois,
cool.
especially around the Chicago area. And as I was doing it, I loved DBT. I loved DBT then, I love DBT now. But then I realized for most of my clients, it wasn't enough.
Mhm.
Things were being left out. Things like the impact of ruptures in attachment or lack of resources or all of that. And I also realized how often therapists and clients lost hope.
Uh-huh.
So, generally speaking, when people are referred to me by other therapists, this is the pattern.
Mhm.
It's because they've lost hope. They've thrown up their hands and they said, nothing else I can do. Might as well send them to Anita Mandley, right?
Right. Right. The last resort.
Exactly. I'm the final stop
Yeah.
on the path. The one thing I can do though, and I start with doing is I let the new clients know, number one, I don't expect them to have hope and I don't expect them to trust me. They don't
Mhm.
know me.
That's great.
Why
Yeah.
would they trust me? They've had a lot of experiences about people not being trustworthy.
Right.
So who am
Well,
I?
that's really important for them to hear, for you to validate things that they're bringing in at that moment.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
also say along that line, then I don't expect you to have hope. That's my job. My
Mhm.
job is I always have hope. I hold the hope. And so I think that kind of beginning, as well as kind of telling them my story, very similarly to the way I'm telling you my story now. I tell it to my clients because I'm like, it's the first step to the rest of the path is for them to know about me,
Mhm.
right? Not, I'm not going to focus, particularly in the beginning, asking a lot of questions about them because, again, they don't know me, they don't trust me. Um, so I have to really focus on building the relationship first. And so
Yeah.
that's how I approach things through relationship, through the attachment, through providing the missing resources, things like that. And
Yeah,
so
that's
I,
great.
I, I agree with that Dan Siegel. He says something, one of his books about the complexity of therapy. And he talks about how psychology is the only science where there's this lack of complexity. People who are behaviorists do behavioral therapy. People focus on emotion. They do mostly EFT. People that focus on, cognition and beliefs, core beliefs. They do CBT,
Right.
and everything's a little siloed sometimes.
Mhm.
Right? But he makes the point that everything, mind, body, attachment, all these different facets are always operating in a synergistic way,
Mhm.
which makes a lot of sense to me. And he says, no other science is more in need of some sort of complex integrative path than psychology. And
Uh-huh.
so that's sort of how I think about things myself is gathering all pieces of the puzzle. And when that happens, it's almost like it opens up a path to a reorganization where I'm not really telling people what to do or telling my story about their story. I'm just gathering the pieces together so that when they're all kind of in the same space and in touch with one another, they can reorganize and a transformation can come about. And then it builds this coherence and opens up a whole different realm of possibility.
Yeah, I love that. And it's very humanizing and valuing of the human beings you're working with, the way you're talking about that. It's not that there's something wrong with you as a person, right? Like there's some reason
Exactly.
why this makes sense based on the trauma that you've been through or based on the environmental factors that you're experiencing, or, it must really make the clients feel valued as you talk about it that way.
Yeah, it's seems to be the case. And then I think around 2012, 2013, I began to kind of take into account this cultural and piece and historical trauma piece. And that was basically prompted by one of my clients telling me one day it was nice to work with a survivor,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of took me aback. And I was almost getting ready to say, well, I'm not a survivor. I've never been assaulted or whatever, never even been spanked,
Uh-huh.
which I think a lot of my friends say, oh, well, that explains a lot about you, Anita Mandley. But I didn't push back. And within a couple of days, I had some images and memories bubble up where I actually had to acknowledge that I too was a survivor, and it was surviving culture and historical trauma. So that experience kind of set me on the path. Then I added the somatic pieces to bring the body in, which was very helpful. And then I realized, along with this cultural historical trauma piece, that there was this intergenerational piece that people carry.
Uh-huh.
And these experiences of trauma that were very ancient. And so I really started looking at that and started having conversations with groups and with people about the intergenerational piece and the impact. And so I think for a lot of people, when we talk about the intergenerational story that they carry and how it has brought them to this moment, it provides another piece of the puzzle for them that's very affirming. It helps things become more coherent,
Mm-hmm.
like it wasn't their fault, right? Like
Right.
I often say, how could it have been any other way? Given all of this, even the intergenerational piece and what's been passed on through the generations, how could this moment be any other way?
Yeah.
And that seems to settle things in my clients.
Yeah, that's great. And so for people who haven't been exposed to these ideas before, can you sort of begin to define a little bit about what you mean by cultural, historical, and intergenerational trauma?
So I kind of started on this path after I had that memory that I was telling you of
Uh-huh. Right.
that awareness. And I started investigating a concept called post-traumatic slavery syndrome.
Uh-huh.
And Dr. Joy agreed. And it was so fortunate. The universe was just like providing so many assists to me. She happened to be coming to University of Chicago and giving a free lecture, a full day lecture. And she spoke to it. And then she spoke to sort of how it shaped the experience of Black people, African American people, and on so many levels. And I started reading about it, investigating it, looked at, for example, I think one thing I talk about is, I think sometimes about that Middle Passage, when they took the slaves, took the Africans from Africa, and they were on those ships. And I think about, well, who could have survived that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think about, it must have been those who could survive with very little food. So they must have had very slow metabolisms, the ones that could survive.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought about, well, how does that show up in the African American community now? Sort of this
Interesting.
vulnerability sometimes towards obesity because of the slow metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then I thought about, they must have had to survive with very little water, the way they were down there in the bottom of those ships. How does that show up today? This being able to retain fluid and water, right? That also shows up in our bodies with hypertension and fluid retention, all sorts of things, everything that, all these medical things. Even when you look at sickle cell, I was reading about how the ability of the blood cells to sickle was a protection initially against malaria.
Mm-hmm.
But when you take that out of the natural environment, it becomes an illness. It becomes life-threatening instead of life-saving. So I looked at all these kind of things, and I'm like, okay. Then I think about, it also must have been who could survive slavery. Must have been the ones who were the strongest, the quickest, the ones who could endure pain. And I think about, well, how does that show up? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it, I think, shows up in being able to be a great athlete.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like genetics. It's a breeding thing, basically,
Mm-hmm.
right? That lead us to this moment. And it's so interesting because I saw a NFL player for a few years, with he had a lot of developmental trauma, a lot of abuse in his history, personal history. And one thing I did with him was some somatic work on regulation and through touch. I do
Mm-hmm.
transforming touch as well. And he was on the table and we were working on it. And somehow, we sometimes talked while he was on the table. And I was telling him a little bit about that. And he looks at me and he goes, it's almost like his face, not lit up exactly, but opened, like some new awareness. And he started talking about this thing that happens in the NFL where you're in a gym, in a gym, and it's like you run they put you through your paces, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
in the circle. You jump, you perform all these tasks.
Okay. Right.
And he said, and you have on little shorts and gym shoes, not shoes and shorts, and basically nothing else, because they're also evaluating your body and all this. And he says, when he went, there was at every place a white man with a clipboard, piece of paper, and a pen, looking at him. They touch his muscles, they whatever. And then he looks at me and he goes, do you think my body thinks it's on an auction block?
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And I said, does that feel like truth to you? They say, yeah.
Yeah.
So I
Absolutely.
just, not that there's any malevolent intent,
Hmm.
just a lack of awareness and education, but his body remembered,
Right.
right?
Right.
And he wasn't on the auction block. His ancestors were, though.
Right.
And so he had a blood memory
Hmm.
that would show up, that showed up with this awareness. So, I think that's kind of one example of what I'm talking about with the post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And then from there, I had this awareness that it wasn't just African Americans, that probably at some point, everybody's has some intergenerational trauma, some
Right.
uh, ancient memory of being colonized or victimized or being in war or whatever.
Hmm.
And and I think sort of when you add that piece, when I've added that piece, it has added to that complexity Dan Siegel speaks to, but it also validates something. Somehow it's like, oh, that's something I could never figure out. I knew there was something, didn't know what it was. I thought I had this one client. Is it okay if I tell these stories?
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, I had this one client, and her parents were Polish Catholic, and they were there during World War II in Poland. They weren't married, but she was referred to me because she struggled with some addictions, um, sexing, cocaine, champagne, um, eating disorders. At one time or another, the full range,
Hmm.
she would have, and all sorts of things. And intractable depression, never had had a sustained romantic relationship. Very smart, 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 smart person. Brilliant. And her brother, who was born 18 months after she was born with juvenile diabetes and addicted to alcohol, and also had never had a sustained relationship.
Hmm.
And her parents were abusive to her, whatever. But in any event, but I finally asked her about how they came here. And she said her mother's siblings, and her mother's mother escaped the Nazis. Went, I think it was Turkey, if I'm not mistaken. But then the siblings went back and fought in the underground.
Oh, wow.
And her father was in a Polish army, but he got captured by the Russians and was put in a Russian labor camp. Let alone the fact that probably Poland, Russia, all those middle or those European countries throughout the times have been conquered and
Hmm.
conquered other, just gone back and forth and all of this.
Right.
So when I heard that story, and I was thinking, and then I told her about what they learned about how trauma changes DNA and even RNA, they're thinking. And it changes the metabolism, the metabolic piece, and hormonal piece, which when we look at her brother born with type 1 juvenile diabetes, it changes the way the stress hormones impact. It just changes everything. And so when you look at all the things that she came to me to get help with, all of those were sort of like attempts to find refuge, and to find relief right? And so when I explained to her all about this intergenerational and the science behind it, she was a science person, pharmacologist. Um, when she heard all that, I glanced at her, she just had tears just streaming down her face.
Oh, yeah.
And I just said, would you like to use a few words? And then she just looked at me and she just said, you mean this is not my fault?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, not your fault. How could it be any other way?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think it was because the messages she had gotten from other providers, other therapists, was that she had the problems she had and dealt with them the way she did because she was either bad or incompetent of what she did or what she did to try to take care of herself. And unfortunately, that kind of synced up to the trauma mind self view of bad things happen to me because
Mm-hmm.
I'm bad or I'm incompetent.
Yeah.
And so it just deepened the shame. And so, yeah, I began to learn that it wasn't just African Americans that carry the burdens of the past, the pain of the ancestors, you know? And so I really tried to intentionally now pay attention to that story of create space for people to tell me the story, not just their stories, but the stories of their ancestors. So I can't imagine sitting with a Jewish person and not asking, were the ancestors in Europe during the wars, or how'd they get here? How were they treated once they got here? Things like that. Even Irish in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
were mistreated. Every new group that came, you know,
Right.
was bullied and victimized or oppressed on some level for some reason. This territoriality thing,
Well,
and this
it's incredible to think about how these things have been. We're probably influenced by things that happened thousands of years ago that just sort of carry through the generations. And some of the things that you're talking about, like the American slavery and immigration and things, like in some ways that's like very, very recent, or World War II. I mean, these are things that didn't happen that long ago, that like grandparents or great grandparents, that absolutely people are going to be very influenced by some of those things, even if there's no memory or connection to the particular events that were happening at the time. And I love the way you're talking about it's just so helpful, because our society sort of looks at the person and says, what's wrong with you? Why can't you figure this out? And I think people sort of get in that mindset about themselves and shame themselves about what's wrong with me that I can't figure this out. And the way you're talking about it is just so validating and humanizing, to let people know that there's some reason why it makes sense that you're experiencing exactly what you're experiencing right now.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's been my experience. And also, I think even just being curious about it with my clients really does a lot to shape our connection to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of them come to me, no one's ever asked them these questions,
Mm-hmm.
never got that history. You go to your first appointment with a new primary care physician, you get like pages, right? What do you have? What did your parents have? What happened with your grandparents? Who, they get this whole intergenerational history, medical history. But oftentimes, as you say, when we start with a new client, we want to know what brought you here in terms of this moment. What are you doing? What have all these other things. We never say, okay, your great-grandparents, where were they?
Mm-hmm.
Right? When did the troubles begin, actually? Didn't begin with you, probably. Was it
Right.
with your parents? I did that a little experiential in a training, and it was on Zoom, so I really couldn't see the people. But I do this little thing where I have them imagine their ancestors before the troubles began.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the instruction. I've never had anybody ask me, what do you mean by troubles or began? None. Everybody seems to get it.
Interesting. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
word. And then I checked back in and I did it one time on this webinar, and this Jewish gentleman comes on. He's a therapist. He goes, I had to go back to the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
And then one of my colleagues, Mary Jo Barrett, she was on the call as well. She says, so did I. And so just speaks to some ancient wound, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at troubles today, it's layered on top of things that go back for these two individuals that were in my training to the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting thing. It pops up where you least expect it. I have this other client who's an Irish, she has dual citizenship. I don't even know if she had ever got American, but she does have Irish citizenship and she
Mm-hmm.
is able to work. I mean, she's not undocumented in any sense. And she has a, you know, complex trauma history, DID history, things like that. And I was watching this TV show one day, and they were talking about how in Ireland, they, the quote unquote gingers, redheads,
Mm-hmm.
get bullied. So I was watching the show and thinking, well, when I think of the stereotypic Irish look, I'm thinking red hair,
Mm-hmm.
fair skin, blue eyes. So I said, well, I'm gonna ask her. My clients, they're sort of used to me like coming up with random questions, and
Uh-huh.
they tolerate me. So I asked her, I said, I was watching this show and this is what I saw, and I'm just confused because this is what I think. And she goes, no. And I was like, ooh. She goes, Irish are Gauls. We have brown hair, brown eyes. She goes, those are Vikings.
Oh my
And I was like,
gosh. Interesting.
oh. She's telling me about the intergenerational trauma,
Mm-hmm.
the historical trauma of Ireland being run over by the Vikings. I would have
Wow.
never thought to ask about that.
Wow. Right.
So this curiosity and this intuitive piece is so, I think, integral and necessary and vital to the way I do my work,
Mm-hmm.
because just something told me, ask her,
Yep.
and to just be curious. And then to notice, what happened in her face and her body. And it was like, you know, that fire. And I was like, okay, there it is.
Yeah. I'm curious, you're sort of talking about it now, but if you're working with a client or perhaps even a couple or something like that,
Mhm.
how soon would you start bringing this into the session, and how would you do? I mean, you're talking about bringing that curiosity, which I guess is part of it, but also, you know, if they come in and say that, hey, we need work on our communication or something like that, are there ways that you can kind of ease into this understanding and make some connections, help them make some connections?
Yeah, couple ways. One, well, especially if you want to talk about my work with couples, I'll generally probably, not the first session. The first session, I'm creating a frame for me, meaning
Mm.
for them to sit with me so that they know me,
Yeah, building
right?
that trust,
I'm not
like you said before.
right. So I'm introducing myself for a lot of the first session. And then I usually end with, given what I've told you about myself, do you think it makes sense that so and so referred you to me? Or how does it sit with you? Do you think it might be worth coming back? Or, so I'm beginning to get curious. I've told them about me, how I work, a little bit of how I think about people and relationships, things like that. So I start also by giving them a little bit of what the path might look like. Like in the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I want to get to know them,
Hmm.
who they are, right? And so that can start probably as early as the second session. And as I start off, I might say, just a little bit tell me about you, and tell me about your parents and their lives, and do you know what their lives were like when you were conceived, even? Or what, all these sorts of things, just gathering. And I'll ask them both. As it turns out, it's an interesting thing. Often, what they tell me as I'm asking these intergenerational questions, gathering this information, or even what's your birth story, or story of conception, all these things, and they're witnessing this. And that's, I think, very crucial, is being able to create some space for them to witness each other,
Hmm.
right? And I'm often a little surprised at what they don't know about each other.
Right.
It's a really interesting. They could have been married 30, 40 years and never know what their spouse or partner's situation was at the moment of conception,
Right.
showed up when they were born, or what happened for the next 6 weeks to 3 months. Was their mother depressed? And, all sorts of things like that. And so there's actually something in being able to hear and witness, each other's story that begins this process. It creates oftentimes, just a little click of a kaleidoscope. I might even ask questions like, what do you think? Once we get into this intergenerational piece, I might ask something like, they, what do you think you carry that you that you carry from your parents?
Hmm.
Is there some kind of pain that they carried, or your grandparents carried, that now you're carrying? And they'll say, often they'll say, yeah, and they'll talk about that. But I also make sure I say, did they give you a gift?
Hmm.
Right? Because I'm building this. Okay, here I'm getting a picture. What are they bringing that's been the pain or the vulnerability or the tension or whatever? And oftentimes it doesn't start with them, it does go back generations, but also I know what the gift is,
Yeah,
right?
that's great.
And so, every time I ask it, I think about myself. Even I was teasing Shane a little bit, and I said I was ready to be on camera if I'm going to be on camera, because I painted my face. But I think about, where does that come from?
Hmm.
I've been painting my face since I was a kid. right?
Right.
I don't think it started with me. I
Mm-hmm.
love to paint my face,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's very tribal. I love a marking. You know, the more, and the benefit for me is the more I have these conversations and in trainings or workshops or even in sessions, it's a circle, not a line. It's not a linear process. It's a circular process because I'm in the circle.
Mm-hmm.
And awarenesses also come to me. I might not say it, share everything, you know, I'm gonna have some boundaries and all of that. But it's not like I'm here on top and I'm imparting these pearls of wisdom to my clients and all they're supposed to do is just receive it, you know, from on high. No, we're in a
Right.
circle and we're here to learn from each other. And that not that their job is to teach me, but if I'm in the circle, how could it not impact me?
Right. I think that's great that we're fellow human beings sharing this journey as well.
Absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And so I think with my couples work, that's sort of how it begins, just simply by having them begin to tell their story and have it witnessed by their partner or other. And I've done the family stuff too. So um, the kids even hearing the stories
Mm-hmm.
impacts the children, right? And then you can even have it where children, even younger children, I'll ask questions, age appropriate, you know, according to their developmental age. But they will start telling stuff the parents never heard.
Uh-huh.
Parents don't know. And I might even ask them, what do you think it was like for you before you came home from the hospital when you were a baby? Now, some of it might be something they heard, but you'd be surprised what they say. And you might say, well, that makes no sense because they can't have any explicit memory. They know something.
That's
They might
amazing.
say, I don't think they wanted me to come home.
Mhm.
Or they might say, I think they love me to death. And I might just say, close your eyes and just kind of feel who do you see there in the hospital with you? Just very interesting. Little children say, I don't see anybody.
Yeah.
So I just file that away, not analyzing it, just witnessing. I had this one client came to me, Irish American fellow in the 70s. Um, and I asked him if he, you know, why did he think he was referred to me? I'm a trauma therapist. What does he say? I said, do you think it makes sense? He goes, I think I had trauma. I said, what was it? What is your trauma? He goes, I think it's my memory of being in the crib and I'm crying and nobody comes to pick me up. And I just said, huh, what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that nobody came to pick you up? He goes, I was a bad baby.
Oh.
I said, oh, okay. Now I know there's no such thing as a bad baby,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't contest his truth. That's his story, right? So I just work with him, work with him. He begins to have this safe attachment to me. He begins to, you know, get more regulation on board through our somatic work and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but eventually, one day he comes, he goes, you know, I had another memory about being in the crib. Now he's the youngest of seven
Mm-hmm.
and all pretty close together in age. And I said, oh, what was this memory? He goes, well, I'm still in the crib and I'm crying. He said, but this time there's a lot of people in the room, in the house, and I hear a lot of voices. I said, oh. He said, but still nobody came to pick me up. So I said, well, what do you make of that? Same question. What do you make of that? Goes, they were probably just overwhelmed. And I said, huh, does that feel like truth? Yeah. I said, okay. Right. So it's a whole different thing that if I had tried to correct his cognitive or core negative belief that he started out as a bad baby.
Right.
But as I added regulation, as I added a safe attachment with me, his capacity to hold more, be aware with more, expand his perspective, to hear more voices in that room, to understand how busy that house might have been with him, his 6 siblings, his parents, grandparents also lived in that house, right? And they're all talking at the same time.
Right.
He had a different awareness, right?
Right. And I love that you're not telling him, hey, you shouldn't think about it like that. You should think about it like this. You're acting more as a guide who might be leading him to, you might have some ideas of where you want to lead him, but you're allowing him to sort of be empowered to be in control of his own journey toward that, which I think is really cool.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I'm not invalidating his story.
Right.
Right. And then one time I was in a training where I was being trained on some somatic work. And one of the students asked the trainer, how do you know when there's been healing? And trainer says, when something new and different shows up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm always checking for. Just like when he said he went from a bad baby to they were overwhelmed. That is very different. That's healing. Then I know there's been healing. It's like checking my work.
Right.
So from time to time, I find ways to check my work. Has something shifted? Is something new? Is something different? Yeah.
And I love what you said when you were talking about this being more like a circle and not as much like a linear process. You know, I was thinking to something you said earlier about the complexity. I think you're talking about Dan Siegel talking about
Right.
how the complexity of all of these things. And, you know, I think that's helpful for therapists and clients, human beings, to keep in mind that, you know, so much about being human is not just a linear process. It's not just about going from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you know, that it might feel messy and it might feel hard and it might feel confusing. And we might talk about one thing one week and something very different the next week, but it's just that circular sort of curiosity, staying open to what comes in and trying to stay in that sort of mindfulness. So I really appreciated that.
Nicely put. Nicely put, Shane. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's exactly it. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time here. Any other final thoughts before we finish?
Well, the only thing I would say additionally is that I think all of it starts with me, in the sense that my awareness that probably the most important thing that I ever bring to a session is my own well-regulated presence. I had to really take good care of myself, but also really try to stay regulated so that have more tolerance, that I have more capacity, that I have more resilience, so that I could sit myself with this circular process, or not rushing to a conclusion, or not trying to fix something that when it's really me that's not tolerating what's in the room.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And I'm trying to get rid of the discomfort, right? Because I can't hold it. But if I can regulate myself, I can sit with a lot without merging with it, but without disengaging for it. I could just witness and join in witnessing, join in noticing. And so that, and also that I never lose the hope, that I can always hold the hope and the possibility of healing and trust the path, that I can trust that path. That's all I was saying.
I love that. And I talk about therapists doing their own work a lot of times. I think that self as a therapist kind of awareness is super important. So I appreciate you bringing that in. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Shane. I've enjoyed having a conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciate it. I'm so grateful. Is there a place people can go to find out more about you, like your website or something, if anybody's has any follow-up questions?
My website is under construction.
Okay.
I not too long ago went from a group practice to a private individual practice, so the website is being slowly built. But if you just Google me, Anita Mandley, you'll find out a lot about me. Somebody's put stuff on the Google machine. Wasn't me, but somebody did it.
Great. Yeah, great. Well, thank you again so much.
All
I'm so
right.
grateful for you talking today. And
Grateful to
hopefully
you,
we can catch up again sometime.
I would love that.
All right. Thank you so much, Anita. I'm so grateful for you. I really appreciate your generosity in taking the time to come on here. I always learn so much, and I just really appreciate your wisdom and ability to teach other therapists. And thank you so much to all you listeners out there. If you have a chance, definitely leave a rating or a review on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you listen to the podcast. Also, if you're interested, this episode is sponsored by the Couples Therapist Inner Circle, which is the membership site that I created about working with couples. And, at this point, there's hundreds of hours of content to help you become a better couples therapist. If you're just starting out, it's a really great way to get going. If you are a very experienced therapist, it's a great way to get education on working with affairs, working with high conflict couples, working with emotionally focused therapy, relational life therapy, all kinds of different things. And there's a really cool new way that I'm setting it up, which is that you can do an add-on bonus to your inner circle, which is about the business of couples therapy. And it's all about building a profitable couples therapy practice. And I'm really excited. I've been working with a bunch of people on building their practice, starting a podcast, being on social media more, all kinds of different goals that people have for themselves, how to use marketing. So I'm excited about that. If that's something that appeals to you, definitely click on it in the show notes. And if you're just interested in the clinical side, then you can get that option. If you want to get the business side, then you can get the clinical plus the business. So there's something for everyone there. And also, there, please join the free Couples Therapist Couch Facebook group. If that's where you're at in your career, you just want to join the free group. That's another great resource to take advantage of. And I'm always grateful for ratings and reviews on wherever you listen to podcasts. Really appreciate that. This is Shane Birkel, and this is the Couples Therapist Couch, the podcast that's all about the practice of couples therapy. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.